Hello everyone, and thank you for coming. As a professor of international relations here in Tokyo at ICU, I'm very often asked questions for which actually I cannot provide a precise answer. And maybe this is just a very polite way to say that I'm often asked questions for which I have no idea what the answer is. And there are two possible explanations for this situation. The first one is that I just don't know what I'm talking about, that I'm incompetent. And I'm afraid to say this is possible, and in fact possibly even likely. But there is another explanation, a second explanation. And that explanation is that my field of specialization, which is international relations, actually does not lend itself very well to clear, precise, and straightforward answers. And of course, it is possible that both of these explanations are correct, but the result is actually the same, whether it is one or the other. And the result is that students tend to get frustrated by this situation whenever I ask questions that are too broad. What I also found since I arrived at ICU is that students in the natural sciences tend to be particularly frustrated by my discipline. Why cannot you guys in the social sciences actually provide precise, clear, simple answers in the way that your colleagues, for example, physics colleagues, or chemistry colleagues, or maths colleagues, even economics colleagues provide? I'm often asked by my students. Now, let me share a secret with you. When students are frustrated, professors also become frustrated. And this comment, why cannot you guys and girls provide simple answers to our questions, is precisely the kind of comment that makes us professors in the social sciences maybe a little bit envious of our natural science professors and colleagues who apparently can prove anything they want and they can prove things objectively. And perhaps that is why we also call ourselves scientists, although of course we call ourselves social scientists, which perhaps is a little bit of a lower rank than the natural scientists. Sometimes I think we are honorary scientists. And I've noticed something else from the questions that I receive from students. And I noticed that the broader the question, the broader the topic actually that we are discussing, the more frustrated students tend to become. And so, just to give you an example, questions like when did the Second World War begin, or perhaps what is the United Nations, tend to go down fairly well with my students. And I think here there is another secret, because broader questions confuse them the most. I think it is not a secret if you are a student, but whenever students are confused, they also become frustrated. And that combination is not a good combination to have in a classroom. So the question that I propose to you today, the question, who owns history, is, I'm afraid, precisely one of those questions that cause great frustration to students. And there are many reasons for this, but basically, at one level, this is an impossible question. Impossible in the sense that it obviously doesn't have a clear answer. But I think it's worse than that. I think it is impossible because it is very confusing. And shouldn't professors bring clarity to the classroom rather than confusion, you might be wondering? Not really. I actually think that professors should bring and should create a certain level of confusion to the classroom, which is, by the way, why I love broad and confusing questions. And the reason for this is that a broad question, so that is to say a question that lends itself to many possible answers, precisely because it is broad and ambiguous, is definitely a question that cannot be answered in a precise way. But a broad question makes us think. And you might be, what I propose to do actually today is to address a very confusing question, a very difficult question, perhaps even an impossible question, which is the question of who owns history. And I would like to see with you whether we can actually learn something from this confusing, difficult question, whether it can actually make us to think things about which we would not otherwise have thought. And because broad questions are more difficult to pin down and to unpack, I propose to start with a case study with you today. And the case that I propose to you today to understand what lies behind this very difficult, maybe impossible question of what is history is actually the issue of restitution, or what are sometimes called historical cultural objects. In other words, whether it is necessary or proper to return ancient objects to, quote unquote, the place where they were taken from. Now, if you can take a look at this image, it shows three historical cultural objects whose ownership is actually contested. And from the left, the first image that you see is the Parthenon marbles, which are also called the Elgin marbles, from the name of the British diplomat who bought them in the 18th century and donated them to his own country, Britain. Now, for many decades, these marbles have been part of the permanent collection at the British Museum in London. And for as many decades, they have been claimed by the Greek government as Greek cultural property. The second image that you see is the Benin bronzes, which is a group of ancient artifacts that were, quote unquote, taken from the former kingdom of Benin, which used to be in Africa. And some of these ended up in museums around the world. Some of them are still in private hands. All of these Benin bronzes are actually claimed by the Nigerian government as Nigeria's cultural property. And finally, the third image that you see on the screen, you have a decorated vase from southern Italy. This specific object was acquired by a US museum through the art market and was exhibited in America for many, many years, in fact, decades. However, it has been claimed by the Italian government as Italian cultural property and has actually since been returned to Italy. So these types of artifacts are often called historical cultural objects. And this description might sound very simple to you, because the words in this description are quite simple. But their meaning, I think, is quite problematic. And to understand why, I think we need to unpack this historical cultural object description. Now, the last word in historical cultural object is object, which is the easiest to define, because clearly what you see on the screen are not people. They are, therefore, objects, inanimate things that are not alive. I would even say not biologically alive. Some people say they are culturally alive. But these are objects. The other two words in historical cultural objects, historical and cultural, are a little bit more complicated than the term object, and in my view, more interesting. So what is it, an object that is historical and cultural? And let me pause for a second here and remember how I told you that my students become very frustrated when they're dealing with very broad concepts or topics. And I'm afraid to say that these two words, historical and cultural, are precisely the kind of broad words and terms that my students get very frustrated, because they're very broad and they're very generic. Remember, we are not natural scientists, we are social scientists. Now, the term historical suggests something old, something from the past, but if you dig a little bit deeper under the word historical, I think things get a little bit more complicated, and I think, from my point of view, more interesting. Now, the term historical obviously refers to history, but what is history, I might ask you? And to say that history is something that happened in the past, I'm afraid is not very helpful here, because billions of events have happened in the past, but we remember very few of them. And in fact, historians themselves only register very few of these events. They register the events that they think matters. So the fact that, for example, we are here right now in this room is definitely a fact, but I'm afraid to tell you this is not a historical fact unless historians decide that it matters. So to say that a certain object is historical suggests something more than say that it is basically made in the past. I think what it suggests is that this object is important, that it matters, but even more than that, I think it means historical, that it matters to us, and that it matters for a specific reason. Now, the next question for us is to look at why is it that certain objects matter so much that we don't call them simply old, which is not very fashionable, or posh, but we call them historical. And I think this is where the other word, the other expression that I mentioned, cultural, actually helps us a little bit to unpack what this actually means. Because in the context that we're discussing, to say that a certain object has cultural, historical significance means that that object actually relates to a certain culture, or at least some form of culture, and that this is what makes that object important. So a historical cultural object is not only an object that is important, or maybe even unique, or certainly significant. It is all of these things, but the reason why it is important and unique and significant is because it relates to a specific culture or civilization. That's why it matters. And we could even say, I think, that that object belongs to a specific culture that has produced it. So that's why I think there is this movement of which you will be aware, which I think is a post-colonial movement, that says, let's give back all of these historical cultural objects to the civilization that has produced them. And on the face of it, I think this sounds all very simple. I think the tragedy of colonization and imperialism have been told many times. And by the way, have been told by my colleagues, the social scientists, not by my colleagues, the natural scientists, which perhaps suggests we are not completely useless after all. But if we dig a little bit deeper, we will find, I think, that whenever we have humans involved, things become a little bit more complicated. And I also want to go back to the third image that I've shown you earlier with the next slide, which is the one of the so-called Italian object or vase, which you now see on the screen. Now, I happen to come from Italy, so obviously I'm not impartial, but I don't think you need to be Italian to appreciate the culture and the art of Italy, which I think are famous worldwide. Of course, they're not as famous as pizza. But in the case of this specific image, I think there is a problem. Because when this vase was made, more than 2,000 years ago, actually there was no Italy. The country that we know today as Italy did not exist. It was only born in 1861. That is, this sculpture, this vase was made 2,000 years earlier. So there was certainly a region at that time called Italy, but that was very different from the country of Italy that we have today. There were many cultures, and they were very different from each other. So if we look at the culture that produced this object, there are also some problems, or at least some complications. Now, you might think this object is culturally and historically significant, and the Italian governments certainly agree with you because they have spent the last decades trying to bring it, quote unquote, home. They claim, the Italian government, that this was made in Italy and it expresses Italian culture. Unfortunately, neither of these statements is true. This vase was produced not only 2,000 years before Italy was born, and therefore it cannot have possibly been produced or made in Italy or by Italians. And only very, very broadly can we say that is related or is an expression of Italian culture. So if you look at this thing, you would see it's many things. It is beautiful, certainly. It is skillful, absolutely. It is artistic, without a doubt. But Italian, it clearly was made in a style and with a taste, and I would say even following the aesthetics of another culture. And that culture is the culture of ancient Greece. Why? Because many cities in the region that we call today southern Italy were actually part of Greek colonies. They were ruled by Greek leaders. They had a population that was made up by descendants of the Greek colonists that arrived in the region that today we call southern Italy. And to me, this sounds more Greek than Italian. So how can a vase, which was made in a place that was clearly not the Italy that we have today, which expresses a culture that is visibly not Italian, and that was the direct result of Greek colonization, how can an object like this become such a potent, such a powerful symbol of Italian historical cultural significance? And also, how could Italian authorities convince the US Museum not only that this vase should be returned, but that it should be returned to Italy and not to Greece, for example? I think part of the answer is nationalism. And I think that nationalism also is one of the factors that motivates the Greek government in its own pursuit of the Elgin marbles. And this is the second historical cultural object which you can see now on the screen. Now, you might think this is very different. And the Greek government definitely would agree with you because they have been asking the British to return these marbles for many decades. And if you look at the surface of things, this case does seem very different from the previous one that I mentioned. Clearly, these marbles belong, by the way, to the Parthenon. The Parthenon is a universally recognized symbol of Greek culture and civilization, and they were acquired by the British diplomat when Britain was basically controlling that land. And by the way, I want to point this out, a very interesting situation, maybe an irony, that you have ancient Greece here, did colonize southern Italy, but Greece today complains about the colonial British. So if you dig a little bit deeper into these objects, I think things here are also not as straightforward as they may appear. And like in the case of Italy, for example, what today we know as Greece did not exist when these marbles were taken by the British, let alone when the Parthenon was built more than 2,000 years ago. And I'm afraid there is more, because ancient Greece was not a country. It was a very loose confederation of states, independent city-states that often fought each other, some of which, by the way, are in today's Turkey. So no wonder I think that my students become frustrated by all this. They say it's just too complicated, and even math, I think, sounds easier than this. But the French have a say, which I think is quite interesting. They say, c'est la vie, it is life. And I think when things involve humans, they always are more complicated. And I think this is a fact of life. So what do these marbles tell us about the issue of historical cultural property? I think there are two positions that compete with each other. One is called cultural nationalism, the other is called cultural internationalism. And on the face of it, they are opposite. Cultural nationalism basically says that cultural heritage should be returned to the countries of origin, whereas cultural internationalism argues that other factors should be taken into consideration other than the place of origin. For example, the ease of access and also the number of visitors that these objects might attract. However, I think personally that neither of these positions actually provide, in my view, solid answers to the question that I asked. Why? Because both cultural nationalism and cultural internationalism ignore that each case is actually very different. In some cases, restitution may be warranted, in other cases, might not be warranted. So I'm personally neither arguing that objects should be returned or that they should be kept at all cost where they are. What I'm saying is that it really depends on the situation and also on the object in question. And I also say that this debate is much more complicated than we usually recognize. And I think the so-called Benin bronzes, which you can now see on the screen, are maybe, and I say just maybe, an example of a case where restitution could be legitimate. At the same time, I think these objects as well raise the question of whom should they be returned to. The Kingdom of Benin, by the way, no longer exists. And parts of its territory are in today's country of Nigeria, but other parts are not. So the question is, who do these bronzes belong to? Nigeria maybe, Africa maybe, or maybe the world. Also, I think the interesting question is, which culture do they represent? And also, perhaps even more importantly, who does that culture belong to? Who does that history belong to? Benin, which no longer exists, Africa, or maybe humanity as a whole. So my conclusion is that issues of cultural property are never easy, and I think they're especially difficult today because nationalism is on the rise, and in some cases it's connected and fueled by post-colonialism in very interesting ways. So I hope that the next time that you hear of an object being quote-unquote returned to quote-unquote their rightful place, I really hope that you will ask this question when you hear all of this. What is actually the rightful place for objects that convey not only the greatness of a specific culture, but also perhaps the greatness of humanity as a whole? Thank you so much for your attention.